Hi everybody, it's Courtney, and today we are making the card that I was probably the most scared about, and this is going to be a mixed media card, which I love to watch on YouTube, but I am terrified of mixed media. So I am starting off with a piece of Canson watercolor paper cut down to an A2 size, and I'm just saturating the paper with water. Now, I recommend taping this down, but all of my watercolor paper is already pre-cut, and I didn't want to take up too much room from the A2 size. So I'm using some Arteza watercolors here, and I'm just dropping in some reds. Just kind of randomly let the water kind of spread it out, do whatever it wants to do. Now this will tone back or dry back a lot. So once it dries, it will become significantly lighter. I'm just taking a paper towel and kind of getting up some of the puddles that have pooled towards the edges, and I let this dry for a little bit. Then I am going to go in and add some more color because you can see that it has gotten much lighter. I'm using the same colors, but I'm adding this to my dry panel. So the panel is completely dry, and I'm just adding those same colors that I added the first time, and then I'm just going to spatter some water and let that water kind of take the color wherever it needs to go. I did kind of have to work it a little bit to make sure it got to the edges. Once again, just dabbed up some of those puddles that had been created with a paper towel, and once again, just let this dry. So for my images, I am going to be using the Slimline Poinsettias stamp set by the Colorado Craft Company, which I didn't pay attention when I looked at this. It's a gorgeous stamp set, but it is specifically made for a slimline card. So some of the images, or both of the images, I should say, kind of end where the corners should be of your slimline card. Well, this isn't a slimline card. So I had to kind of position this in a way so that my images would be complete. So not a lot of it is actually going to be showing. I attempted to use my mini MISTI for this and realized that it's just not going to work. So I had to bring out my full-size MISTI, and because I knew so much of this was going to be hanging off the edge. So once I finally got this situated the way I wanted it to, so that I could have the leaves of the poinsettia be complete, I went ahead and stamped this out. Now I'm stamping with Blackout ink by Ink on 3. You can use any ink here. It's going to be covered up. So I'm not worried about getting a great impression, just as long as I can see the leaves, see the impression. I did end up stamping it twice. This is textured cardstock. It's watercolor paper. So I usually stamp it at least 2 times, most of the time 3 or 4 if I want a really good impression. I flipped around the panel and I'm going to stamp it again, and I'm going to stamp it in the same position. I'm leaving my stamp in my MISTI. You want to make sure that you leave this in your stamp positioner. So in order to add a little bit more dimension to the leaves of the poinsettia, I'm going to bring out some Copic markers, of course. I mean, that's a different medium, right? I guess mixed media is just different forms of media, more than one. So I guess this would count, but my collaborator is the queen of mixed media. So if you actually want to learn something, definitely head over to her channel. So I'm just adding a little bit of shading to the base of each one of these petals and kind of just working my way up. Now the color that I'm leaving off with is just a little bit darker than the background colors. So it will kind of fade off to those background colors. The tips of each one of these leaves will pretty much not have any coloring on them. I'm just using the background as the highlight of each one of these leaves. So I colored them all the same. I didn't do anything crazy. And if it's hard to tell what is what, don't worry about it. Just color it the way you think it's going to be, because I guarantee if you can't tell, neither can the recipient. So now that we have some color, more color to the poinsettias, I'm going to re-stamp these. I'm going to treat my panel with my anti-static tool, and this time I'm going to go ahead and stamp with my Versamark ink. I did once again stamp this twice, and I was just hoping that it lined up good. It didn't do too bad, but I know my paper is already pretty warped, so I wasn't going to be overly surprised if it didn't line up perfectly. But I did stamp that twice. Once again, you can't really tell with the Versamark because it's clear ink. So I wasn't sure until I added my embossing powder how this was going to turn out. Once again, flipped my card panel around, treated that area with my anti-static tool, and stamped this out once again 2 times with the Versamark ink. Next, I'm going to sprinkle on some gold embossing powder by Ranger, and this is where you're going to find out whether everything lined up correctly. And it actually pretty much did. And this is where it's actually going to come to life, because right now it kind of looks a little bit blotchy, but once we have those gold embossed lines of the image, it will kind of all come together. So I let my heat gun heat up for about 30 seconds or so before bringing that to the paper. I usually like to avoid any warping or as much warping as I can, but as you can see, this panel is pretty warped already, so it really didn't make too much of a difference. But now that we have the gold outline, you can kind of see how it's all coming together. Now for my sentiment, I'm going to use one of the sentiments from the stamp set as well, and it's just the Merry Christmas. However, like I said, I always stamp at least 2 times with watercolor paper because it is textured. No, I didn't do that. I treated it with my anti-static tool and stamped it with an acrylic black. And then once I sprinkled on the embossing powder, it didn't stick to all of the areas because I didn't get the greatest impression. And I tried to kind of pour a little bit more and kind of squish it down with my finger because I could see the outline of the sentiment, but it just wasn't sticking. So I just sweeped all of that off, and we're going to add a sentiment strip over it because you can obviously see where I stamped it. So to add my sentiment strip, I decided to layer some embossing powders. I'm going to take a piece of cardstock. You can use any cardstock for this. I just grabbed one from my stash. It's just Nina. And I'm going to squish my Versamark ink pad right on the bottom portion of the card panel or for the cardstock, sprinkle on some of that gold embossing powder, and heat set that. Now, when you're heat embossing a large area like this, it tends to look a little bit bumpy. It's not necessarily that smooth. So in order to make it a little bit more smooth, which you can't really tell on camera, I'm just going to add another layer of embossing powder. So I'm going to let this cool down for a second, add some more Versamark, sprinkle on even more embossing powder, and heat set that once again. Now, once this is all heated up, you'll notice that you'll have a much smoother finish. And of course, I still have to add my sentiment to this. You will want to make sure that it is completely cooled down, which really doesn't take that long. It takes probably less than 30 seconds to cool it down. And again, I'm going to treat this one more time with my anti-static tool. And this time I am going to be stamping with VersaFine Onyx Black ink, which is a fast drying pigment ink, but it's not so fast where you can't heat emboss with it. So I'm going to very carefully stamp that. Remember, we're stamping on an embossed background, so it's a little bit slippery. You can use your MISTI or your stamp positioner for this, but I didn't really have too much of an issue. Sprinkle on some clear embossing powder this time and heat set it. Now all the embossing powder is going to kind of melt together, and it's just going to give a really cool effect that you can't really, the camera just doesn't pick it up. So once again, let that cool for a couple of seconds, and then I'm going to cut this down to just a little bit larger than the sentiment itself. I really wasn't sure about the length at this point, so I kind of just cut off the bottom and the top, and then kind of just played around to see how big I actually wanted this. Now, it was just going to blend in too much, even though it's not going against a gold background. I just felt like it just didn't pop as much. And if you guys have watched my videos before, you know that I like to have my panel and my sentiment really pop off the page. So I'm going to do what I always do. I'm just going to layer this onto some black cardstock. So I ended up trimming down just a smidge on all 4 sides of my card panel. That way my images will still be kind of the same if I take the same amount off of all 4 sides. Then I cut a piece of black cardstock just a tiny bit larger than that. It really is not going to give you too much of a border because I didn't want to cut too much of my images off. Went ahead and glued that down to the black cardstock, and I'm also going to do the same thing with the sentiment. But instead of having to measure the sentiment, I'm just going to take another piece of black cardstock, fit that right in the corner, and just leave a small border on the left-hand side and on the bottom. And then all I have to do is trim off the right and the top and kind of sort of eyeball it and just make sure that I leave roughly the same amount of space so that I have a little bit of the same amount of a border around all four sides, if that makes any sense. Of course, I'm using my mini tonic trimmer, which gives me the best results for getting into those small little areas. So before I add this sentiment, I wanted to add some spatters to the background. So I'm going to bring in some gold gouache, and this is also by Arteza. I'm going to squirt just a little bit of this on an acrylic block, use a paintbrush, and add just a little bit of water to kind of water that down a little bit. And then I'm just going to spatter it. Now, this is a fairly thick paint. It's thicker than acrylic paint. I think it has a mixture of acrylic paint in it. It is opaque. So it's not like regular watercolors where it will be transparent. And I know it's very hard to see. And here's where I accidentally put my paintbrush right down onto my panel. But this is mixed media, and I'm going with it. So once that had a few minutes to dry, I went ahead and adhered this down to my card base, and I'm also going to adhere my sentiment strip, and I ended up laying this flat. You can certainly pop it up, but I wanted everything to be kind of flat. Not the best mixed media card I've ever seen, but it was fun to make, and hopefully I'll get a few more materials so that I can play around with some more mixed media. So my collaborator today is Olivia, and like I said, she is the queen in my eyes of mixed media. So I definitely suggest you check out her video for today as well as her entire channel because she's super talented. Thanks so much for stopping by, and I'll see you guys again tomorrow. Bye.